The Story of an Hour is a short passage by Kate Chopin. It is rich in symbolism and has ulterior messages on feminism. Kate Chopin introduces the story of an hour with this very sentence. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. This is important because we learn who Mrs. Mallard is. She has a heart trouble that will affect her by learning of her husband's death and cause her to go on an emotional roller coaster. This is important to know because it will affect the turning points of the story. Mrs. Mallard's behavior is very peculiar. Kate Chopin writes, she did not hear the story, as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden wild abandonment, in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. This is unusual because most people go through a state of denial after such grave news. When my aunt died, I could not believe that she was actually dead until I went to her home and I saw her children, my cousins, and my uncle. And even then I was half expecting her to reappear at any moment, smiling with that great white smile of hers, saying it was all a joke. However, she was dead and my dreams were not going to happen. Mrs. Mallard, on the other hand, she skipped that stage of grief and went straight into the crying fest. As a matter of fact, that crying fest did not last that long, since it lasted less than an hour. And she withdrew herself to isolation instead of seeking further comfort from her sister. What happens after she locks herself up in her room and what she views when she peers out the window is far more odd and unusual than her skips in the stages of grief. It is written she could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and the countless sparrows were twittering in the yews. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled, one above the other in the west facing her window. The scene and the imagery in it is very surreal and Disney-like, as in the moment when Snow White opens the dwarf's windows and sings and has the animals assist her with her chores. It is very eye-opening and unusual, since usually when a character dies in a book or in a movie, the skies are gray and there's thunder about and lightning. And instead of having twittering birds, you have crowing ravens and shocking motions, not so light and dainty. Mrs. Mallard is described as follows. She was young with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. This very stanza is one of rising action. You can see here that she's a young woman, perhaps between her 20s and 30s, and her lines may have been caused by the stress of being with her husband. However, now that she's alone, you could see possibilities lurking in the back of her mind. These repressed emotions are beginning to show themselves in Mrs. Mallard, and although she may not know what they are, it's a shift in her life, and there is hope for something more than the life she currently has. At the very climax of the story, she comes to terms with her newfound freedom, and it is written as, there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon their fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention make the act seem no less of a crime, as she had looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. In this very paragraph, she comes to terms with her newfound freedom. And although she may not be socially free, she gains a certain liberty, and any liberty is better than having none. She loved him. She loved her husband very much, but what she's about to gain is far more satisfying to Mrs. Mallard than all the love she and her husband could provide for themselves. Because as a woman back in her day, she wouldn't have many opportunities to speak her mind and do whatever she pleases. She's usually burdened with the task of pleasing her husband and keeping the house in tip-toppity shape. Now she finds something new and something to look forward to with her life. And although other people may not understand her, she is grateful for what she has gained and understands the sacrifice that was made by her husband in order for her to gain such confidence in herself as a woman. In the moment previous, she's the most powerful woman she's ever been able to see herself. But as she gains the confidence to come out of her room and go down the stairs, it is overwhelming, and her heart could no longer take it. The joy and happiness of finally being free. So she dies upon the stairs at the very moment her husband arrives. And he had not known there had been an accident or the free thoughts his wife had had upon losing him. The doctors came and said she had died of heart disease, of a joy that kills. However, I don't think any character in the story realizes that it's not because Mr. Mallard arrived to the home that she dies. It was because of the happiness that she felt when she came out of her room and descended down onto her friends and family. This is an important moment to realize, because it is ironic in how by gaining freedom she dies because she can't take in everything that was repressed from her. Like a leak in a dam will burst it eventually, because the water pushes and pushes until the dam can no longer hold it. That was Mrs. Mallard's case with freedom. And Mrs. Mallard was finally able to gain a sense of being alive for purposes other than her husband. Because before she was only physically alive, but emotionally she was dead. But on her final moments, she finally reached emotional life. And in that process, she lost her physical life. The ignorance of not knowing what freedom was what kept her alive. But the death for her realization. And the closest she's ever been to freedom in her life. It is all metaphor for women's rights in the day. Women were alive merely for their husbands. Rebelling against it was socially murderous, and would lead to shunning, mental institutions, mocking, and far worse. Even today, we don't have that much of a progress in terms of equality. There is a slight male dominance in today's world in countries such as the US, and women in third world countries still face situations similar or worse to Mrs. Mallard, in which their husbands may be abusive and they have no right for themselves. Equality is an important thing that Kate Chopin spoke for back in her day, and it's still a world issue that needs to be resolved. It is incredibly important to be able to resolve this issue for all the women who have fought for it in the past and the women that are going to come to the future. Because humanity is not just man nor woman. Both are needed for humanity to progress, and we can't progress without having equality, because having one superior to another is simply going to end with one-sided ideas, and the world revolves around having different ideas from different types of people. So it is important that we take this lesson from Japan, that we need people to be on equal terms, that we need women's rights in this day. We need feminism, not only for the women who are locked like birds in cages with open doors but are unable to exit them, but we also need it for men too, since men are also repressed in the way they must be their family provider and are incapable of showing emotion. Feminism is a thing that's needed by both genders in order for progress, and this progress can only come through change within ourselves, our community, and later on a city level, progress into a national, and later into an international level. The only way to start a change is within yourself and having it project outwards onto others. And that is what Kate Chopin did upon being widowed. She changed her personal values, and through her messages she was able to change close family and friends and readers of her book that continued to agree with her despite decades being passed since her literature was written.